afternoon and a warm welcome to our House and to the event Green Finance Sustainable Investment in Fragile Environments. This is an event we are hosting today at the IISS at our headquarters in collaboration with Adelphi and is part of the London Climate Action Week. My name is Irene Mia. I'm Senior Fellow for Conflict, Security and Development and also Latin America here at the IISS. And I'm very pleased to be chairing the event today together with my dear friend Beatrice Moselli, Senior Advisor at Adelphi. So we will be sharing the moderation and the chairing. Let's see how it works. The event today focuses on a crucial issue for global and regional climate security, which is making sure environmentally sensitive regions such as the Amazon and other tropical forests are protected and developed in a sustainable way to preserve biodiversity and ensure global climate mitigation. Channeling funding to this context has, however, been a major challenge so far, with insufficient climate finance being available for these very fragile areas. The increasingly restrained fiscal space of government in fragile environments makes international public and private finance in particular important. Yet investors are somehow reticent to invest in those very complex contexts. And this is because of the very complicated mix of risks they face there in their activities, including environmental crime and convergent drug trafficking, especially in the Amazon, but also social conflicts around the natural resources. In our work at the IISS Conflict, Security and Development Program, we have long analyzed and covered the conflict and security risk related to climate funding in fragile contexts. We also highlighted many times the need for more research to better understand those risks, but also to design international standardized framework that identify, assess, and responsibly navigate those risks, which could then be incorporated into international policy design, programming, and implementation. So we are really looking forward to this event, to a lively conversation on those main risks investors face when financing projects in fragile context, but also on the strategies and framework to mitigate those risks. And we have, obviously we have all of you, we have around 200 people online. And also we are very lucky to have a great panel of expert practitioners, which I'm going to present to introduce just in order of speaking remarks before we start. Our first guest is Dr. Sandra Guzman Luna, who is the founder and director of the Climate Finance Group of Latin America and the Caribbean. Previously, Sandra has served as Director General of Climate Change Policy at Mexico Secretariat for Environmental and Natural Resources. She holds a PhD from the University of York and also has studied in several universities, including Oxford, LSE, Flaxo, and UNAM in Mexico. Her work on women climate leadership has received global recognition, including awards from Marie Claire, Chevening, and Forbes. We are also joined by Dan Litvin, who is the founder and CEO of Resource Resolution, a new venture dedicated to the resolution of conflict and societal division over natural resources. Daniel previously founded Critical Resource, which was a leading advisory firm on sustainability and geopolitical risk facing resource asset. He's a senior advisor to ERM, the world's largest sustainability consulting firms. He's also visiting senior fellow at the LSE Grantham Institute of Climate Change. Previously, Daniel was an advisor to McKinsey & Company Rio Tinto Leadership, a senior fellow at Chatham House in energy, geopolitics, and environmental correspondent at The Economist. We're also joined by Mohamed Zia, who is a climate security advisor with UK Government Integrated Security Fund. In his role, Mohamed is setting up programming that aims to tackle some of the key climate security challenges facing us today. He has a mix of policy programming and technical expertise from his time working in Ethiopia, regional conflicts, and also on working on the Afghanistan and Syria crisis within the government, the UK government. Mohamed holds a BA in Natural Sciences and an MSCI in Hard Sciences from the University of Cambridge. And finally, we're joined by James Houghton, who is Managing Director of the Global Finance Institute Europe, leading on European strategy and building relationship with key public and private sector stakeholders. James is a founding member of the Sustainable Energy Finance Association. He's also an advisory member of the Science-Based Target Initiative Expert Advisory Group on Buildings. That's a very long name. And a member of the core project team for the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. He previously worked as finance and ops director for a charity and spent 16 years at Goldman Sachs in Europe and Asia, managing teams across a range of financial products, from commodities to equity derivatives and vanilla cash equity. Before I pass the floor to my friend Beatrice for her comments, for her opening remarks, just a final note on housekeeping. So we will run this event starting with a round of opening remarks by the 4 speakers here in the room. And then we will open the event to participation in the room, but also online. We hope it's going to be not too complex to manage. But for the people that are joining online, in order to make the discussion more as interactive and inclusive as possible, it would be really good if you could actually type your question comments on the Q&A box you see on your screen, so we can then combine them with the question from the audience. And with that, I will pass the floor to Beatrice.
Great. Thank you so much, Irene, for the great introduction. And also from my side, a very warm welcome and good afternoon to you all. I'm Beatrice Mosello. I'm a senior advisor at Adelphi Global. For those of you that don't know us, Adelphi Global is an international not-for-profit think and do tank based in Berlin, in Germany, with a very small chapter in London, which is me. So I'm very glad to be here today, and I would like to thank our host, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, for having us in this beautiful room. And I hope after the event you can enjoy the fantastic view on the Thames this afternoon. So just maybe a couple of words. I don't want to take too much time out of our experts and speakers on the panel. I just wanted to share a couple of remarks. Again, at Adelphi, many of you may not be familiar with what we do. We focus on research, advisory, and dialogue, capacity development on everything related to climate, environment, and development. And the team I sit in has worked for the past 15 years on climate diplomacy and security. So really kind of using our research to understand the intersections between climate and conflict, with a very focus on fragile context, and with a focus on understanding not just what the risks are, but what are the entry points for programming and investments that can simultaneously build climate resilience in this context, but also contribute to stability, to economic growth, to social equity. So you'll understand that today's topic is very much at the heart of what we do. However, in the past 10, 15 years, what we've seen is that, as Irene was saying already, although there's been a lot of talk, a lot of debates, a lot of conversations, a lot of research, a lot of evidence going into this, there's not been a lot of finance going to support this type of integrated programming that can deliver resilience and peace building, stability objectives at the same time. And we've seen this conversation coming all up and up. A lot of focus has been put on this gap, particularly since COP28, where in Dubai 2 years ago, where member states, I don't remember the exact number, but more than 120 signed up the Declaration on Climate Resilience, Recovery and Peace that had a specific point about the need for climate finance to reach those that live in the fragile, conflict-affected context, those that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, but also, and because they are also vulnerable to situations of conflict and fragility. And these commitments have been reiterated last year in Baku, COP29. However, COP29 highlighted still the major gap in terms of financing, particularly for adaptation and resilience. This is a big priority of COP30, the Brazilian presidency for this year's Conference of Parties of the UNFCCC. We're in almost at the end, but at the very core of London Climate Action Week that has been happening all around us this week. And I've heard so many times the Brazilian presidency talking about the importance of climate finance for adaptation and how much of a priority it is for them. So what we really want to do in this event is hearing from our experts, hearing from you, and we hope that we'll have some proper time for involving you in the discussion as well, about what do we need to bring this very much needed finance to fragile and conflict-affected contexts. Not just the climate finance that come from government and multilateral development banks, but also very much needed private sector finance that needs to fill the gap that we're seeing at the moment in terms of needs and supply of finance. I'll stop here. I'll give the floor back to Irene and to our speakers today.
Thanks, Beatrice. And so we can now start with our first round of introductory remarks. Maybe I will start with Sandra and really ask you, when we look at the enormous challenges around channeling funding and really climate finance to fragile environments, what are the top priorities, an area of focus? I mean, I'm thinking about building trust among different stakeholders, the global north, the global south, the financial architecture, which is obviously not fit for purpose, but also what would be the different pathway to go to arrive to that and also to COP30, please?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. I think that it's a very important and timely conversation that we have to have. I would like to start reflecting precisely that one of the biggest challenges that we are facing in the climate finance agenda, or in the sustainable finance agenda, generally speaking, is the lack of trust. Where is the money? A lot of countries are talking that money has been increased, that there is more availability of resources, that there is a mobilization that is including public and private resources, but the critical conversation from developing countries is who is accessing to these resources. But most importantly, what is green finance? What is sustainable finance? What is climate finance? And the lack of definition has been also one of the problematic issues. One of the conversations that we are having is that it is very important to start reflecting what is this climate finance, what is this sustainable finance, to start building trust, to start talking about the same flows, the same financial flows. And for us, as GFLAG, we have been working a lot tracking financial flows. And for us, this sustainable side of the story is not only increasing financial flows that will help us to reduce emissions or that will help us to increase resilience, but it's fundamentally the transformation of the financial system to reduce investments in those actions that are increasing the problem and start transforming the way that the financial system is thinking. Because it's not only about creating green products within a bank, but it's more fundamentally mainstreaming climate change, mainstreaming the protection of nature, mainstreaming the access for vulnerable people to the plans of these financial institutions. And this is precisely one of the biggest challenges that we are facing, because there is a status quo. A lot of financial institutions do not want to see this as the main agenda, because at the end of the day, not all actions related to climate and environment will be profitable. And adaptation is precisely one of them. But one of the critical elements that we have been discussing for 10 years since the Paris Agreement was created. Let's remember that there is the Article 21C, the article that is at the heart of the Paris Agreement, that is talking to us not only about the stabilization of emissions in no more than 1.5 degrees, ideally no more than 1.5 degrees, but it's also talking about making all financial flows consistent with these low greenhouse gases and resilient development. And the Paris Agreement is talking about the transformation of all financial flows. It's not only talking about public or private, it's about talking about the transformation of all financial flows. But this transformation won't happen necessarily at the same rhythm in every single country. And that's why developing countries are also talking about how can we continue accessing to financial resources. Beatrice was talking about, for instance, what happened at COP29. There was a new collective quantified goal agreed. Maybe you remember that back in 2009, there was a commitment to transfer 100 billion from developed to developing countries to address the needs of developing countries. But this commitment hasn't been fully complied. And now the new goal is around 300 billion. This is only 3 times more than the previous goal. But I want you to reflect about the cost of climate action and the cost of reducing these problems in developing countries is valued between 5 and 7 trillion of dollars per year. So imagine the new collective goal, 300 billion, in comparison to the 5 or 7 trillion that are needed. So this means that there is a massive gap that we have to transform, that we have to close, but we have to close it not only in terms of quantity of money, but more fundamentally on quality of money. So what is the opportunity that we have ahead of us? We have the COP30, as Beatriz was saying. The Brazilian presidency is very committed, and they have a task. And the task they have is to design the Baku to Belém roadmap that aims precisely to design what is the future of climate finance and how this future relates to other processes. So 4 critical elements on this roadmap are, first of all, yes, totally agree. It is important that this roadmap learns from the past, from the mistakes that we observe when it comes to finance. And the first one is close the financial gaps. Mitigation received more or less 80% of the climate finance flows around the world, adaptation less than 15%. But if you think in the needs of developing countries, most of developing countries need to adapt. And most importantly now, need to cover the loss and damages that are happening in our countries. I'm from Mexico, I live in Zimbabwe, and I experience every single day the impacts of climate change. And for us, it's not necessarily a trend. It's not something that what we need is really to transform the way that we fundamentally live in developing countries. And the second element is about the quality of finance. You know that in Latin America, 90%, I repeat, 90% of sources that are related to climate finance are in form of loans or any type of mechanism that generates debt for developing countries. So what happens that we as developing countries are paying with our public expenditure the cost of this type of finance. So it's a circle or a cycle that perpetuates the impacts that we have. So the small fiscal space that we have is not helping us to tackle all these issues because we are prioritizing other agendas. We need to reduce poverty, we need to generate jobs. And this is the opportunity that we have to transform not only the quantity element, but the quality. How can we increase the accessibility for instruments that are highly concessional and that will help us to invest in a more effective way? And finally, it's a matter of who is benefiting from this climate finance. Yes, we see a trend in the generation, for instance, more and more renewable energy projects, more and more Teslas around the world. That's beautiful. But who are benefiting from these transformations are not indigenous communities, are not local communities, are massive corporations that are looking in climate the big opportunity to generate profit. And this is precisely a tendency that is just continuing and perpetuating the model. And the model is extractive. Our countries are also now in this dilemma because now it's not only oil, is lithium and other mining products that are being extracted in our territories to feed the industry, but not changing fundamentally the lifestyle of people. So what we have in front of us is the opportunity to redefine the system, and the redefine the system implies the redefinition of the goal of the purpose of the multilateral development banks, the purpose of the national development banks, but also fundamentally, how can we mainstream really, truly, these climate, nature, and people in our public finance systems, not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And this opportunity of the roadmap is to connect with international processes. For instance, now we are gonna go to Sevilla to talk about the finance for development. And let me tell you that this is a huge problem because we are seeing reduce the overseas support. The U.S. is out of the process, and we are lacking leadership. We need leaders that are pushing for these agendas and that are pushing for connecting the dots across the reform of the financial system, the finance for development, the climate finance, and all the different agendas are interconnected. So it's important for us to stop talking in silos, but really bringing on board not only all the financial institutions, but fundamentally the people that really need it, that really need this money to make transformations. Otherwise, we are just going to repeat the same model. So I will leave it there as just starting points. I'm very, very happy to continue the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sandra. That was great. I mean, I think you raised so many important points, and I think really what you were saying about the mainstreaming, I think is key. But also it's very interesting what you were saying about the quality of when we talk about the finance gap, we never really think about those issues we were mentioning about the quality and the fact that most finance is loans, right, which are not exactly what would apply to climate justice in a way. And I really like also what you mentioned about the lack of leadership. And I think it's something that obviously at the IISS we are, geopolitics is really our bread and butter. So I think it's really going to be interesting to discuss about those issues later on how the geopolitics actually as a reflex and what is the, in a way, abdication of leadership of the US going to have in terms of maybe, you know, other power rising and replacing the US. But I think we'll have time to discuss all these issues. I'm now passing the floor to Daniel, and I guess what would be interesting, just follow up on what Sandra was saying, maybe really look, you know, in your large experience in the extractive sector as well, what role can extractive companies and investors play in managing environmental and climate risk in fragile context? And also, what are the strategies you've seen, you have worked or you've seen implemented which can transform societal and geopolitical conflicts surrounding natural resources into mutually beneficial outcomes? What is all this space of the extractive industry? How can it help in these big challenges we're all experiencing?
Sure. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. As Sandra said, a really important topic and a lot of expertise on this table, but I'm sure in the room as well. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. So the short answer, Irena, I think, is that my short answer is the extractive sector has a potentially huge role, but it struggles hugely as well in these contexts. So we need some new and better thinking, to my mind, both from the private sector, but also from governments and from NGOs and civil society as well. I think all parties need to rise to the challenge. Just to explain what I was thinking was just to offer 4 very high level thoughts. And as you suggested, my background is more private sector in the sense that I spent most of the last 20 years advising resource companies, so mining companies and energy companies, on some of the social and sustainability and geopolitical risks around their investments, trying to encourage responsible approaches. And then most recently, I've founded an organization, Resource Resolutions, which is based on a view that conflicts around resources are already quite significant, but they're going to get worse in the years and decades ahead. So to try and raise understanding on all sides and bring sides together. That's where I'm coming from. And so it's less around the sort of the specifically green investment, green finance, hugely important though. That is, my focus is more on the natural resources sector, big natural resource companies. With that context, 4 high level observations. One is that I think there's going to be a lot more investment coming down the track in natural resources in fragile contexts. It may not be, it's not necessarily the investment that we want in large scale, namely in nature protection and emissions reduction, but nonetheless, there's, why do I say there's going to be a lot more of this natural resource investment? You're probably all familiar with this, you know, critical minerals, the need for vast additional quantities of materials like copper and nickel and lithium and cobalt, etc. If the world is going to build the electricity grids, the wind farms, the solar farms, the electric vehicles, etc., that are needed to meet our targets, plus other factors. And by the way, even just in the renewable sector, you know, it goes without saying that the best locations for wind and solar are often, you know, in remote locations. But in terms of the minerals, you know, the minerals are where they are around the world geologically, and often the particularly in OECD regions are much better explored and exploited than remoter, say, parts of Africa and Latin America. So there's probably going to be, you know, the estimates of hundreds and hundreds of major new mines needing to be developed. to meet the needs of the energy transition, but not just the energy transition. There's also reshoring of supply chains. There's also the huge increase in defense expenditure and all the minerals that are needed for that, AI, etc. There's a lot of reasons why the experts think that the world's going to need a lot more of this stuff, and a lot of it in remote regions and ecologically and socially fragile regions. So a lot more of this stuff, whether you want it or not, I think, coming down the track. Secondly, my second sort of high-level observation is that we clearly want the responsible operators to do this investment. But we also need to face the reality that even the responsible operators, in my experience, struggle a lot in fragile, socially and environmentally fragile regions. Why? It's partly to do with the way in which major international companies, and they are usually major international companies, they may seek to fully understand the social and environmental context where they're operating, but often they don't quite understand it, and particularly on the social side. And that's where my experience focuses more. And I studied a little bit of anthropology at university, and I always remember reading fascinating ethnographies about remote communities in remote parts of the world. And the anthropologists, having spent 4 years with that community, would come back to their university and write up a thesis. And the conclusion was, well, I'm not quite sure what was happening here. And yet major resource companies are having to make decisions within months, maybe sometimes weeks, about the nature of the social context of the regions where they're operating. It is not surprising that even if they do make best efforts, they don't always, that they often they misjudge. And likewise, even and once they're operating, a lot of these major companies, big resource companies, they often will have in place exactly the right sort of policies on social and environmental sensitivity, respect for human rights, etc. But the repeated challenge many of them have found is ensuring that across complex international organizations that they are, that all of their assets and operations are abiding by those principles, and that information about where there may be risks is flowing correctly to the headquarters of these companies, and that they're creating the right incentives for local managers on the ground who are always facing a little bit of a dilemma between, do I just develop this project and maximize production and profits, or do I slow it down for a bit and really treble check that I've abided by all the group policies of the company? So even responsible companies, it's quite difficult to get this right. Third point is that, meanwhile, to my mind, there's a growing risk in the world that the investment flows into these fragile regions will be undertaken by less responsible operators, right? Why? And it's perhaps obvious stuff. And it's partly this, everyone will be familiar, I'm sure, with the growing geopolitical, what you might call a scramble for critical minerals and other resources. And when you have a scramble between China and Western countries and Russia and Middle Eastern powers and other countries that you might, are similar to the great powers of the 19th century, when you get this sort of scramble for resources, there's such an intensity of competition that, to my mind, social and environmental standards will go down the agenda a bit. Plus, you've got, of course, from the current US administration, this disdain, you might say, for environmental, social, and governance issues, the relative downgrading of international anti-bribery and corruption rules. So a lot of reasons to believe that the state of the world as it is, it's almost opening a way for the less responsible operators. And by the way, incidentally, well, perhaps we can come to this, I think it places a huge burden of responsibility on campaigners and civil society to get their campaigning right. I think there's a danger in, as is often the temptation, in just focusing on the high profile companies that have major international brands. I think instead the campaigning should be about the sectors as a whole, to make sure that you're not just creating room for the less responsible operators. Final point is to the new organization I've founded, and Resource Resolutions, which, by the way, has both senior industry backing but also backing from former government and civil society figures. I just see a perfect storm brewing in the years ahead in terms of the level of conflict around natural resources. There's this rush of investment that we're expecting in power stations, data centers, mines, but it's in a context, not just in fragile ecosystems, but all around the world, very low social trust, geopolitical competition, a lot of arguments between companies and governments, likely exacerbated by climate change in the years ahead, particularly on issues like water, where there'll be growing scarcity. So it's a recipe for, the history of the world has always been about a bit of conflict for resources, but I think we need to take some, urgent measures, both companies, governments, and civil society to find different pathways through this. I'll perhaps leave it there.
That was really, really interesting, Dan. And I think it is actually quite complex, as you mentioned, right? Because sometimes it's very difficult for company also that wants to invest responsibly to really understand the complexity on the ground, right? Because obviously you mentioned the social aspect, but there is also in our case, we do a lot on organized crime, and that's actually a very big concern in many of those areas. So I think the complexity is both domestic, but also, as you mentioned, the geopolitics, which again has a big role. And I think you actually described very, 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 very forcefully how the geopolitics are going to, intersect with these needs for more extractive projects. So I think it's a great challenge to think as we progress in the conversation. And I hope we can have some conversation also on what are the best practices, and also in your experience, if there is any company particularly that has managed and navigate these issues in a more successful way. So I think I love to now turn to Mohammed. And obviously the Integrated Stabilization Fund is a really interesting cross-governmental initiative aimed at addressing climate, environmental, security risk in fragile regions, especially. I think it would be really interesting for us, for me in particular, but for the audience, to understand better how the fund works, what are the goals, the challenges, and also particularly in terms of catalyzing, I would say, private sector funding and other type of funding in that context.
Thank you so much. And apologies for the sniffles. I've got a bad case of hay fever, as I'm sure many of you do. But thank you so much. Yeah, really interesting panel, and really, really delighted to be here. My name is Mohammed. I'm the Climate Security Advisor with the Integrated Security Fund, so an HMG fund. I want to sort of talk to you guys about who we are as a fund, some of the programming that we're doing in the Amazon in particular, and then bring this back to the question that you asked, Irene, around sort of what does this mean for investors, what does this mean for the private sector, so on and so forth. And we come at this problem through quite, a sort of third lens, as it were, in comparison to the other sort of panelists, because we are primarily a national security fund. So the ISF is the government's cross-cutting national security fund. We are here to tackle the highest priority national security problems that government faces, many of which cut across departmental lines. We're a blended fund, so we use both overseas development aid and non-overseas development aid funding. But all of our programming must adhere to at least one of four principles, which is that it must either be integrated, catalytic, high risk, or agile. So the whole point being, we're not here to do business as usual, sort of big development type programs. We're here to take on the slightly riskier programs, try things out, and if we try something and it doesn't work, that's okay. The whole point is we're here to try different things and see whether they work, and hopefully, and I'll come on to this in a bit, kind of de-risk some sort of lines of activity. And so moving on to our Amazon programming, in the Amazon, you have a really complicated problem. You've got widespread deforestation, which is driven by a number of factors, the state, private business, criminal actors. You have a complicated illicit economy operating. You have differing laws across different borders, many of the borders are, exist only really on maps. They're often streams, rivers, or simply forests. And you have blurred lines between legal and illegal markets. And so you're operating in a really complicated context. And that means that you need to, I guess, really understand or try and understand what's going on before you make programming interventions. And indeed, you have to have a higher risk tolerance as well. If you put hundreds of millions of pounds into the Amazon, as some of the other speakers have spoken to, you risk doing a lot of harm unintentionally. And so that's where we come in. We're, because of our sort of expertise in sort of both being a national security fund, we can work with those harder actors, but also because we have a higher risk tolerance. And, we're happy to operate in environments where, there is that slightly higher risk and see what we can do to de-risk them a little bit. So going on to our sort of Amazon program, our Amazon environmental crime program looks at engaging these problems, looking at sort of, both UK climate priorities, UK security priorities, and then the sort of climate and security priorities of the region as well. Its fundamental aim is to support a safer, more stable Amazon with reduced criminal activity, healthier ecosystems, and empowered communities. And it's got the following outcomes: strengthened UK security and of the region through decline in money laundering of serious and organized crime assets, but also reduced environmental harm and biodiversity loss in the Amazon. And we do this in 5 different ways. We've got sort of 5 strands to the program. So firstly, we work with security and justice institutions from across the region to encourage them to follow the money through strengthening financial investigation and supporting asset recovery schemes. We're tackling green corruption and strengthening risk mitigation practices in local and national government to reduce the risk of officials being corrupted by the forces of organized crime. We set out to strengthen regional cooperation and collaboration to tackle environmental crime through bringing institutions together to build trust, share information, and support, whilst also supporting ACTO, the Amazon multilateral sort of organization on this particular topic, as they look to develop a regional approach to tackle these issues. We're supporting investigative journalists who shine a light on the impacts of these crimes on local people. And we're also looking to support Indigenous voices and protection mechanisms for environmental defenders who face real threats to their survival. And I guess the idea, coming on to sort of, well, what informed these activities and therefore kind of what lessons should we learn from them and how can we apply them in sort of investing in these contexts? I guess it was our activities were informed by a number of different factors. The first was fundamentally, we actually took quite a lot of time to build an evidence base. We did sort of deep conflict analysis, deep crime analysis. There's a body of research that points to, for example, the fact that Indigenous communities have a really vital role to play in reducing the amount of deforestation. And indeed, lots of this was informed by a do no harm principle, as I sort of talked about earlier, and indeed, as many of the other speakers, both of the other speakers have spoken about, you have a real risk of, you can put lots of money into a place and actually, with good intentions, and you can do some real harm while doing it as well. And so it's really important, therefore, to think about the consequences of how you're using the money, where you put it, and sort of what the second, not just the first order, but the second and third order consequences might be. And the third thing in particular that we sort of tried to, when we were designing this program, was sort of trying to look at it through 2 lenses. As you'll have noticed, we've not tried to decouple the deforestation and serious and organized crime problem here. We've looked at them together because fundamentally in the Amazon, they are extremely linked and it's very hard to tackle one problem without engaging with the other. So if you don't engage both problems, actually how much are you really solving the issues that communities and indeed, states and governments in the Amazon are facing? But also you'll see that we're working across multiple different levels. We're looking at the communities through Indigenous people, we're looking at the state, we're looking at the country, we're looking at multinationals at a sort of multinational, regional sort of level. Through this program, we're kind of looking across multiple levels. We're not just looking at one, because you have to understand the bigger picture, but you also have to understand the local level dynamics. And I think the last thing I'll say on this in particular is that, you can't have a shoot the baddie approach. Simply doesn't work. We've talked to lots of police, and they were sort of saying, well, look, yes, it takes us days to get to where these illicit finance, these operators are operating. They have watchers on the lookout. They can see us coming from a mile away with our helicopters and whatnot. You have to really try and attack this problem from multiple levels to engage with it. And therefore, I guess, what does this mean for investors? And I realize that, I'm coming at this from a sort of UK government perspective, and that there is a huge body of work going on sort of mobilizing green finance. As a national security fund, we're more focused on the kind of risk aspect of things. And so, from my end, I look at it through, multiple lenses. I think the first is, and I think to cap it, sort of, we recognize that, investors and others are not governments. They don't have huge amounts of money necessarily to throw at a problem to do really, really deep conflict and crime analysis, like budgets are limited. So you can't do everything. But I think there are some principles, and Dan sort of touched on them as well. You have to think about unintended consequences firstly. Have you assessed, or have you done some level at least of assessment that looks at your conflict? What are the drivers of conflict in the space that you're in? Have you thought about what's driving the crime that's in these spaces? Have you thought about your climate? If you're trying to tackle a serious and organized crime problem, or you're trying to invest, have you thought about climate and biodiversity and those sorts of issues? I think the second thing is you can't just look at investments through a national level lens, and indeed Dan will be able to speak to this and others as well. You have to look at both local dynamics, national dynamics, even multinational dynamics. How is your intervention going to impact local communities, for example? Are they bought into it? Are they going to benefit from it? How are indigenous communities going to be impacted by this stuff? And I think the last thing I sort of want to say, I mean, I've talked a lot about due diligence, is fundamentally in these sorts of spaces, you have to really embrace complexity. I think it's very easy often to sort of, often there's a real focus, and we all, everyone does it. How do we simplify a problem? How do you make it easier? How do you make it easy to tackle? But in really complicated scenarios, yes, you have to make things easy to tackle, but fundamentally you have to recognize that they're complicated problems. And when you're investing in them, you have to sort of recognize that, you are changing the dynamics of that problem. And therefore you have to embrace the complexity, and you have to recognize, and you have to work through that complexity, not ignore it. So that's where I'd like to leave this for now. But of course, yeah, really, really looking forward to sort of further questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Mohammed. I mean, this was actually great because you basically really highlighted all the complexities element, no? And I think for us, especially working on conflict, it is always quite interesting what you were saying, like in terms of also having always this kind of multi-dimensional lens almost that you need to look at, even those kind of organized crime syndicate in the Amazon are now transnational. Right? So it's very important also to look at the regional cooperation and how the states and all the different stakeholders react to that. So I think it's really interesting. I like what you said about embracing complexity, because without understanding the complexity, you cannot really, and this is actually something that it's also in a way putting a break to investors, because many times you don't really know how to, what's happening there. So I think it's interesting what you were also suggesting in terms of a framework to really try to map those risks and include them in our risk assessment, which I think is something that is missing. And I think, as we mentioned, we like to do more research on that as well. Moving now to James, I think all this kind of complexity and also the importance of cross-sector, cross-border cooperation. How does it actually translate in the finance space? And I know that the GFI, as a leader initiative, together with also UNDP, BioFin, UNEP, FI, the Revenue for Nature initiative. So I think it'd be really interesting for us to find out a bit more about the initiative, and it concludes the first part of the event.
Thank you. Yeah, and I can be brief. Thank you for having us here, and I'm really interested to have this conversation with you. Just briefly, the Green Finance Institute, we're a non-for-profit, philanthropically funded organisation that started in the UK, but we have operations across the globe now in Southeast Asia and Latin America. And we do a lot of some of the collaboration and the sort of the interlocutor, neutral broker piece of work, bringing in unheard voices and communities and businesses with investors in the supply chain to see exactly how we can get capital flowing from the private sector into those businesses and organizations that need it. And the point that you were talking about, the Revenues for Nature program, is funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. We are working with UNEP FI in the UN BioFin, and it's really to address this mismatch between the amount of funding available for nature restoration and what is required to make that restoration financially viable, and how we unlock private sector capital to do that. And so we have on our website, the program is really about amplifying revenues for nature that are actually working, so real world revenue models. And the one I'm going to talk about just briefly is in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. These sectors are already benefiting from protection and restoration, but a lot of that is conservation only. So there's grant funding, which lack some of the traditional revenue streams that are required. So that makes them sort of harder to finance. So if you look at the platform, there are 50 real world and they're global examples that demonstrate different forms of income from carbon and biodiversity credits, water company payments, tourism payments, premium product branding, and the like. And these revenues can start to underpin these nature-based models, and they're working. And I think the reason why they're working is threefold. And what private sector, and I mean by private sector, I mean the supply chain, particularly those of us that are buying some of these products, but also private finance that can underpin some of those companies that are operating. The three things really are one is revenue certainty. So there's a requirement for revenue certainty, and that's clear and credible sources of income. I think that is important. And so you're building markets around biodiversity net gain, carbon credits, nutrient mitigation, and the like, and those sort of verified ecosystem services, which I think is, that second point then around outcome verification and standards is important. So the MRV piece that some of us will be very familiar with, making sure those outcomes are paying for what they're supposed to be doing in terms of local businesses, biodiversity uplift, cleaner water, more resilient fisheries and the like. And that then the third piece that sometimes needs to underpin that is some of the risk sharing. So that some of the financial wizardry, which isn't actually that complicated really, it's around finding philanthropy, finding concessional capital, finding the piece where that'll take some of that early stage risk that will then allow some of these business models to work. So some of these projects need some of that concessional capital, and we do some of the work to find out where that needs to come from, the philanthropy and and some of the other organizations that provide that. So the example that I want to talk about is this Fisheries Improvement Fund, which was developed by Finance Earth and the World Wildlife Fund that we've been amplifying. Oceans, I think, have around $24 trillion of economic value. There are 600 million people in the world that are supported by, the livelihoods are supported by oceans, but they're chronically underfunded. I think $1.2 billion a year goes into oceans against the sort of 15.8 billion that's required. And the model, which is already working in Chile, embeds the cost of sustainability directly into the seafood supply chain. So private capital provides an upfront loan to the seafood supply chain, and that gets stock assessments, gear upgrades, and for increasing local capacity in local businesses, and then processors, and that is those that are buying the fish. So large supermarkets and the like are paying a volume-based fee directly to the fisheries and the like, who then are able to do some of that sustainable practice, say gear upgrades and the like. And some of that money then gets paid from that supply chain, then gets paid back to the private capital that is put forward that upfront loan as it is. So that loan repayment is done from, so currently actually it's the Wharton family that have done that loan. And then so Costco and Golden Eagle, that are a large supermarket in Ohio, for instance, are paying per kilogram of fish that they're buying. So the model works in Chile. It's expanding into the Maldives, and I say so it's reducing waste and really keeping the value of the businesses in the local coastal communities. So it's aligning commercial incentives and ecological stewardship really. So it is working, and I say, and that is, I think, something that we're looking to build on, because we have risks and disclosures, and I think they're an important part of a foundational part, but I think those won't, we need investable projects really to actually move the needle on this. So we are looking at developing high integrity nature markets. We're looking at supporting project developers and land managers, and that's our technical assistance and the blended finance piece that we can offer, and engaging the private sector. So actually looking at companies that are buying these products and saying to them, if you look at the net present value of the risk that you're taking by not investing in these local communities to have more sustainable practices, then actually they'll go out of business and you're going to go out of business in the way. So how do you bring that cost forward so that they understand that and they need to pay for that now? That's really what we're looking at.
That's great. That's really, really interesting. I mean, I hope we have time to discuss whether there are other examples, but I think this idea of embedding really the cost of sustainability into the supply chain is really quite powerful. I think I have a lot of questions, but I see the time it's running. So Beatrice, up to you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Irene. And indeed, really, really interesting conversation so far with our speakers. But we have a lot of expertise in the room and online. So let's make sure that we hear from you as well. So I suggest, first of all, we have another speaker that has very kindly agreed. He couldn't join us in person today, but he agreed to give us 2-3 minutes intervention online. And I think we will get him online somehow. And I'm very pleased that Giovanni Grossman, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, the director of Green Corruption Program of the Basel Institute of Governance, is joining us online, hopefully.
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, yes, great.
Fantastic.
Amazing. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. Yes, I mean, it would be great to hear from you also on your experience very briefly, and maybe some reflections on what you heard from our panelists today. I'm not quite sure where to look. But
It's a voice from the...
It's a voice.
The voice from far away. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, and thank you to IISS for hosting this fascinating conversation, and to the speakers for the very insightful comments. At the Basel Institute on Governance, we have a special program focused on green corruption, as we call it. So the intersection of environment and climate change and corruption on the other hand. And what we have found is that, unsurprisingly, I suppose, because many speakers referred to the challenge of underinvestment in this space, that governments also underinvest in the measures that are required to ensure that these investments are safeguarded from an anti-corruption and integrity perspective. And Mohammed kindly and generously referred to some of our engagements in Latin America, which combine this law enforcement effort on one side, so pursuing the financial angles of environmental crime, which are rarely looked at, and on the other hand, building solid safeguards and compliance systems, both at the regulator and key state-owned enterprise levels. And we do that in 8 countries around the world. And so my reflection and my question to the panelists would be related to this key question of how to mainstream integrity into these processes. I think it was the first speaker who referred to trust. And that is, of course, a rare commodity nowadays, and one that is very fragile and can easily be disappeared with one or the other scandal. And we've seen quite a few in this space. And yet we don't frequently see an active focus on strengthening integrity measures. So I'd be very curious to hear out the panelists' interventions in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giovanni. Really interesting to hear from your experience as well on green corruption and the kind of challenges also from the government side based on the work that you're doing. I suggest we take a couple of questions and then we go back to our panelists for a first round of responses, and also maybe if they have reflections on what the other speakers have presented. Floor is open. See Sri, lady here, and the lady down there, and Laura. Maybe let's take 4 to start with.
Thank you so much. Nazanin Mashiri, International Crisis Group Senior Analyst, working on climate, environment and conflict. Just from my perspective, I work for International Crisis Group based in Nairobi, and I've researched and analysed and reported on from some of the most conflict-ridden parts of the world, including Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, also the Sahel region, and looking at how to get climate financing in these very, very difficult and sometimes intractable conflicts and wars. And one thing I've noticed, and I tend to agree with Daniel here, is that there is a very low risk appetite for getting any kind of climate financing into these regions, but there's a big risk appetite when it comes to investing in, mining and getting, those extractive resources out. DR Congo, more than 100 armed groups, but you see mining happening even in the most difficult context there. So the question I guess I have is that, if we put all the climate financing together, from all the vertical funds, everything that's going in, it's still not enough. So don't we need to be thinking sort of out of the box on this, really, and having some new thinking? And I know that, others are looking at this in this space, people like Avanish Persaud, who's looking at, taxing the polluters, international levies. The reality is that the kind of climate justice question is no longer going to cut it anymore. Europe is preparing for war. It's investing in war, investing in military. And the cost of doing nothing and that kind of argument is no longer working anyway. We know that $1 every adaptation money, the profit of that is like $10. We know that already. Those cost benefit arguments have been made. Should we be focusing more on the stick rather than the carrot, and focusing on taxing the polluters and taxing the people who are responsible for this? Thank you.
Thanks. Really interesting question. Is the lady here?
Thanks. I'm Joanna Wolstenholme from UNEP WCMC. My question was kind of on the same lines, but thinking some really interesting points, but it got me thinking around how to accelerate investment, because there's obviously a need to accelerate investment and private investment in all sorts of fragile environments. I think more about biodiversity environments, but all of these environments we've been talking about, but also whilst not accelerating the harms, and that kind of balance, particularly like you mentioned, Daniel, around the role of NGOs and others in holding standards up, but also just not scaring off investors altogether. Thanks.
Great, thank you. It was Laura here, and then it was somebody on the back. Yeah, perfect, great.
Thank you. I'm Laura Mir from Conciliation Resources. We're a peace-building organisation, for those that don't know, and I work specifically a lot at the moment on the links between climate and conflict, and really enjoyed this panel and the different perspectives on it. And there was a lot that really resonated with a lot of the local organisations and local partners I've been working with. One of the risks they always say is not the risks of the natural hazards and impacts of climate change, the physical impacts of climate change, but the responses to them and the risks that they see in their context from that. So my question is, there's a lot of kind of suggestions here on what should be done better, what we need more of. We need more climate finance in these areas. We need to do it in a way that is less risky. But if as we're in the run up to COP30, what's the kind of one big policy change we would ask for, that this needs to go beyond nuance, that every bit of climate investment needs to be conflict sensitive, and how do we make sure that happens?
Thank you very much, Laura. And then there, great.
Thank you. Sahil Shah, Tipping Frontier. I was curious about the panel's thoughts on political risk insurance when it comes to de-risking green investments, and obviously the high premium associated with political risk insurance because of the size of the markets. And if there were any thoughts on effectively how those prices could be reduced and what mechanisms could be used.
Great, thanks so much. I would start maybe with these 4 questions that seem challenging enough for our panel, for our speakers. I would invite you to pick and choose the question that you see fits best with your expertise. And let's try to address them all. Maybe Sandra, you go first. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to my co-panelists and for the questions. And the first question that came to my mind when I was hearing my colleagues is this idea that we will have to extract anyway because it's kind of the model that we have to continue to cover the needs. I was wondering, needs for whom? No, and I think we need to talk more about this because it is true that we need to transit energetically and that we will need resources, but I think the question that we really need to ask is the type of systems that we want to see, no? Because I don't think that the idea of just expanding renewable energy like to like illimitedly or electromobility is necessarily, it's gonna save us, no? In terms of climate change. But I think we have to redefine, like, are we trying to cover the needs of cities that are increasing their consumption? Like, are we trying to feed the models, for instance, like in the US or here in Europe, is the type of model that we want to feed? And definitely there will, this WWF example in this report is saying, if we want to continue fulfilling these needs, we will need like 9 planets, no? So I think it's the question is, it's more fundamental than that. And that connects me with the actual reality of the territories. I have been in the Amazon many times because I work with colleagues there. And I think what they really want is such a basic respect of the territories. In what they are observing is the impacts of the transition in other countries. So for instance, in Europe, we are talking about this transition that is needed, and they go and their companies and also other companies, not only Chinese, Canadians and others, are going to the Amazon to explore, to extract, with no benefits for the people. You know, like I said, I'm from Mexico. In Oaxaca, we have projects from renewable energy right next to communities that don't have electricity, right next to the communities that don't have electricity. So I think I would like to challenge a bit the conversation here, because I don't think that we are understanding the actual problem. It's not about making projects more bankable to attract the investors or to talk about the role of the private sector to increase profit to save the world. I think that we need to start thinking in what type of investments we really want to attract, and how we are going to increase the impact, but like more in a circular way, like not only like the big companies, but really making sure that the communities are being benefit from this. Because when we talk about insecurity issues, let's talk why Amazon, why Mexico, why all these countries are so risky. Why? Because there is a huge people living in poverty and they do not access to the profit of all of these companies. So I would like to invite you to rethink, why are these places risky? Why in our minds are so risky? And so I think all these problems are very structural. Of course, there is corruption, but there is corruption also in Europe and in the US. So please don't say that only corruption is in the global south, because that's so not true. But yes, in the global south, we have structural problems because we are battling with other very, very deep discussions and very deep problems. In Latin America, the major emitters, we receive 20 times more money from extracted activities than from climate finance. So the actual incentive to pollute is huge. And a lot of the companies that are investing in our countries are from Europe. So in Europe, Europeans are trying to decarbonize their economies, but guess what? They are transferring their companies to our countries. So I think it's going to be a really important discussion to talk about insecurities, but putting in the table the right drivers, why Mexico is so bad now with narco traffic, what narco traffic is expanding in Latin America, why our countries are still living in all of these poverty issues, because there is not an equal distribution of wealth, and because the support that we should be receiving is not arriving in the right sectors, in the right populations. Yes, we should talk about taxing the richest, because it's not a matter of scarcity. I think we have to stop talking that there is no money. There is money and there is a lot. And you saw a huge problem fight down here next to our country, like in that those type of arms, that type of weapons are not cheap. So trust me, there is not a scarcity. It's a problem it's a lack of will, political will from countries. So the fact that the UK and the US and many others reduce their ODA to invest in security is a huge issue, and we have to talk about it. So are we being really going to the, I came from Bonn. Sorry, my voice is finishing because we were discussing about this. And guess what? They are very angry to talk about their responsibilities in providing finance support because they are saying that they do not have enough money. But we are seeing a war right next to us, so it's not that. So yes, there are a lot of people that are being very rich thanks to the extraction in our territories. So I think it's important to tax the richest and the most pollutant and stop subsidies in fossil fuels, because these countries are also investing a lot of money in fossil fuels, subsidizing the extraction of all of these problems. So we are paying for our own, like we are talking here about climate change, but these countries are paying to continue the problem. So, and I would like to say so many other things, but I think really, and here you are clever people. I think we have to stop talking about just how our countries are so risky and so dangerous, because I think there is a story, there is a history about why the Amazon is in the position that they are, and it's not the people. Are the companies that are coming to extract and to live in a very terrible condition. So it's not the people that is risky, are the companies that are coming to create the dangerous situations that we are facing now. So please don't talk about us as we are the risky people, because we are not. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sandra. I think a lot of food for thought and some really important urge to rethink indeed how we frame the question here, because that's also a way to kind of get to different answers that I think we all agree we need. Daniel, I'll let you speak and choose what question you want to address. I think there was one particularly over the integrity of how do you mainstream the integrity in processes, particularly in companies. I think there's one also about maybe also Mo can try and tackle from our online audience, thinking about the kind of legal guarantees that must be put in place to secure financial investments, good financial investments. So maybe if you want to reflect around some of these or anything else you'd like to say.
No, thanks, Bea. I might, there's so many interesting ideas flying around. I might just select one, just very few. It seems to me, and perhaps focusing on your really good question around, and I come almost as an outsider to the specific issue of, say, climate and green finance, but I observe exactly as I think you're saying that it's not much money coming through, or nowhere near the scale, and not, obviously one hopes that the next COP is hugely successful in that respect, but the world doesn't seem to be moving in the right direction. So it does raise a really good question into my mind. So where's this money going to come from for protecting the environment and as well as people? And it is absolutely the case that often extractive industries are the main foreign, source of foreign investment in many of these regions. And the question in my mind, though, is a bit then flipped, right? Because, and my view is that rather than, I'm not remotely averse to taxing pollution. I think there should be more of that, nor am I averse to redistribution of various sorts. But I think the more powerful solution to the problem is to create the right context for more investment flows, whether it's more investment flows of the responsible sort, which we know can, in cases of highly successful economies, which are resource-dominated economies, like or have where resource sector has helped driven a lot of poverty reduction, whether that's Botswana or Chile. We know that if you get the investment climate right, you can attract huge investment in resources. And we also now have the tools not always to do it perfectly, but with the responsible companies to ensure that you can actually fund nature protection, so have net benefits in terms of nature protection, and also in various ways support decarbonisation. So that could be a hugely powerful mechanism. Maybe if it's done well, could dwarf any amount of money that might feasibly flow into green finance over the next few years. And in that respect, I would just perhaps, because there's too much to say, but I'll stop my comment shortly. I would urge all of the highly capable, intelligent groups and people working on this issue to focus more on understanding the private sector and understanding in a sense, I sort of flip between these worlds, and I'm always fascinated by how the language is utterly different. The sensitivities are utterly different. Their worldview is so contrasting, and it's little wonder, given that it's there. People talk, but there's not much. There's not the sufficient action, and I think private sector investors are often far more risk averse than outsiders might understand. But they're also somewhat lemming-like. Once they get excited by something, they pile in. And if you do believe, as I do, that the right sort of investment can be very, very powerful for all these broader social and environmental goals, the focus, to my mind, should be on getting the investment climate right, putting green finance to one side.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. Very important points. And I couldn't agree more with the focus more on understanding the private sector. I think we all speak in different languages, and that's is basically the issue at the basis of this lack of trust that you both referred about, and the importance of dialogue that kind of gets us to speak the same language, and that would be the first step towards mobilizing some of this positive investment that can have multiple benefits. Mo, I'll get to you. You can tackle all the questions you want, but I'll add you one more for you from our online audience who are asking how successful governments have been solving these problems. So if you want to share a couple of thoughts on this as well. Exactly, very easy one.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a lot of questions. And I'll just sort of caveat all of this by saying that as part of the fund, we are not in a sort of policy making role. We're in a sort of more of a sort of how do we translate policy into delivery? And I recognize there are a few sort of policy questions that I think may be better discussed in the sort of plenary afterwards. But I think sort of touching on a few of the questions, I think, just on integrity, I think from my end and from our end, a lot of this is about consistency. It's about sort of sustained, consistent engagement with CSOs, with local communities, but not just engaging with them, amplifying their voices. So in December last year, we held a Wilton Park conference, which is a sort of think tank, which is a sort of FCDO think tank. We held one in the Amazon or in the region, where we connected policymakers, parts of the sort of security setup with indigenous communities, with CSOs on the ground, with journalists, and we sort of brought them all together. And I think so much of this is about, speaking to the point that other panelists have made, this is about, bringing to light their voices and then amplifying them, and then actually sort of saying, okay, well, how do we integrate that into our work and into our programming? It's about bringing it all together and not just sort of saying, oh yeah, thank you very much for that opinion, that's great. It's about really taking it seriously and bringing it together. And I think you have to really make an effort to do that consistently. You will see, obviously, as we talked about, odor cuts and other bits. Obviously, the geopolitical context is changing, but I think nevertheless, there's still a really clear focus within our fund and indeed with others on gender, on inclusion, on ensuring that we make sure we engage with communities who are impacted. Those sorts of focus areas aren't going away regardless of what the funding picture looks like, because they're fundamental sort of programmatic foundations to the way in which we work. And speaking to sort of how successful have governments been, well, I think the picture is really, really mixed. Truthfully, I think you see lots of programs. Admittedly, there aren't sort of programs that there aren't programs at the moment that spring to mind that have been really unsuccessful, but there are definitely lots of examples of them, you know, being very honest. But, you know, we've, at the moment, for example, we're doing some programming in the Sahel, looking at livelihoods. So this is an FCDO program, but looking at livelihoods, looking at climate security, looking at, you know, the justice system there, and sort of bringing it all together. And that's, you know, had a really significant impact on the sustainability of the way in which farmers and others engage with sort of agricultural problems and other bits. But it's, again, you know, meant looking at things through a community lens and also looking at them through a sort of, you know, consistent, you know, looking at them consistently and trying to tackle the variety of factors that impact, you know, a problem, not just looking at it through a sort of singular lens. And then just two other quick points. Laura, you mentioned conflict sensitivity. I mean, that is really, really key for us. It's sort of absolute bread and butter part of ISF programming. Conflict sensitivity is, you know, is almost the very foundation of the work that we do. And I think there's a strong recognition now within government as well that conflict sensitivity needs to be a really important part of the climate finance conversation. They're not separate. I think, you know, there's an increasing momentum there. And then just quickly on sort of renewable energy finance and accelerating investment. I mean, many of you might have seen that the PM announced at the G20 the sort of clean power, the Global Clean Power Alliance, and sort of some of our sort of clean power missions, and the finance mission in particular is really, really, it's not my area of expertise, but I know that it's really, really clear on the fact that, you know, public and private finance go hand in hand. It's not just about government finance making things happen. It's about government finance supporting the private sector to invest in spaces. And so, you know, just to reassure in many ways that we really recognize that, you know, the two things go together. They are not separate. And there's a lot of work going on now to sort of integrate the two. Thanks.
Great, thanks a lot more. And I'm aware that we're running a bit late. So for those of you that have to leave us, please do. For those of you who can spare 5 more minutes, please stay. And James, last but not least, please feel free to tackle any of the questions you'd like to.
Thanks. I'll be brief. We had an interesting conversation. We hosted an event about just transition finance yesterday. And it was myself and a friend who was part of the South African delegation for the JETP. She was representing South Africa. We had this sort of mock negotiation where we didn't prepare, and I played the part of the donor country, and she played the part of the recipient country, which, you know, we didn't name as South Africa, but her lived experience is from that. And I felt we don't have we're going to do some work on this. We don't have the answer, but we felt like two things. One is that we got the sequencing wrong with the conversation. It felt like that I had gone away as a donor country and come up with a number, and we decided then that, well, how does that number get dispersed? And it just felt like totally the wrong way around. And I was wanting to know about risk and how we de-risk, and I went to early stage projects and what's the political risk piece. And she was very much trying to stay up at I want to tell you what it is that we need as a country, and let's do it that way. So it was very interesting. I feel like we got the sequencing wrong. I think some of the instruments that we're using to fund in climate finance we don't have yet. I don't have the answers to that, but I do know that we get stuck on a number, and then it's sort of dictated about what the risk and returns are of that number. And it's not actually about what the country needs or the fragile environment, how we're talking here, what actually the needs are. And so the conversation, the sequencing of the conversation seems to be totally the wrong way around. There are some instruments out there, political risk instruments, like the World Bank has MEGA, obviously, and we're looking to grow that. We are actually part of the Global Clean Power Alliance, working with the World Bank on that finance mission, and that will be looking at the concessional piece and what some of the guarantee structures that can be put in place. But put in place too, you know, and then going back to my first point, we are able to have investments in early stage risky things. I take your point about risk. But we are able to find ways of investing that benefit the thing that you're investing in. But we don't have that yet for global climate finance that I've seen. It's still, you know, the money is flowing the wrong way. I take that absolutely that point, and the money is there. But I think we need to do some work. I think we need to, you know, if we can slow down a bit, sequence the conversation properly, get those power dynamics fixed, and then work out what those instruments look like.
Great. Thank you so much, James. Really important remarks as well to conclude the event. We're running super late, so I'm very wary of trying to summarize this very, very rich conversation in minus 10 minutes. Maybe I will just highlight 3 kind of keywords that stuck with me from this conversation. One is complexity, and really the need to kind of understand this context. And as Sandra was saying, what drives fragility? Why are people opposing projects? Why are people frustrated? Why are people engaging in criminal activities? Understand the context and tailor the investments and to the needs of the conflict, of the context, and to the environmental also situation on the ground. Lack of trust. Really need to, have these conversations much more often, bring different stakeholders in the room more often, try to speak the same language and understand each other better. What are our incentives? What are our structures? How do we work? And finally, not just quantity, but quality, particularly when we talk about fragile and conflict-affected states. We have finance, we have resources. It's about how we spend them, where we spend them, what type of investment we pursue, and with what tools. And we have the tools at our disposal. So I think if we go to COP30 with these kind of priorities in mind, maybe we can make some significant progress working all together to address these huge challenges that we have in front of us. And with this, I thank you all for coming. I thank our panelists. Amazing job, really interesting discussion. I thank Irene and the colleagues from the International Institute for Strategic Studies for the partnership, for having us today. And maybe you want to say a couple of words to conclude?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, because I think you did a fantastic job in summarizing, and I think the complexity will stay with me. And I think also what you were mentioning more, the consistency of really trying to have a roadmap which we follow. And again, many thanks. Thanks so much for joining us, and wishing you a great rest of Climate Week. Hope it's going to be as good as this event today. Thanks so much for joining us. Bye.